Hey my friend. How are you? Today I am going to talk about, what are the causes of diabetes. Diabetes causes vary depending on your genetic makeup, family history, ethnicity, health and environmental factors. There is no common diabetes cause that fits every type of diabetes. Because the causes of diabetes vary depending on the individual and the type. Click the link below in video description to learn a little known, but 100% scientifically proven way to erase your diabetes, in 3 short weeks. Type 1 diabetes causes. Type 1 diabetes is caused by the immune system destroying the cells in the pancreas that make insulin. This causes diabetes by leaving the body without enough insulin to function normally. There is no specific diabetes causes, but the following triggers may be involved. Viral or bacterial infection. Chemical toxins within food. Unidentified component causing autoimmune reaction. Underlying genetic disposition may also be a type 1 diabetes cause. Type 2 diabetes causes. Type 2 diabetes causes are usually multifactorial, more than one diabetes cause is involved. Often, the most overwhelming factor is a family history of type 2 diabetes. This is the most likely type 2 diabetes cause. There are a variety of risk factors for type 2 diabetes, any or all of which increase the chances of developing the condition. These include obesity, living a sedentary lifestyle, increasing age, bad diet, gestational diabetes causes. The causes of diabetes in pregnancy, also known as gestational diabetes, remain unknown. However, there are a number of risk factors that increase the chances of developing this condition. Family history of gestational diabetes. Overweight or obese. Suffer from polycystic ovary syndrome. Have had a large baby weighing over 9 lb. Other diabetes causes. There are a variety of other potential diabetes causes. These include the following. Pancreatitis or pancreatectomy as a cause of diabetes. Pancreatitis is known to increase the risk of developing diabetes, as is a pancreatectomy. Polycystic ovary syndrome. One of the root causes of this is obesity-linked insulin resistance, which may also increase the risk of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Cushing's syndrome. This syndrome increases production of the cortisol hormone, which serves to increase blood glucose levels. An overabundance of cortisol can cause diabetes. Glucagonoma. Patients with glucagonoma may experience diabetes because of a lack of equilibrium between levels of insulin production and glucagon production. Steroid-induced diabetes. Steroid diabetes is a rare form of diabetes that occurs due to prolonged use of glucocorticoid therapy. Click the link below in video description to learn, which 5 veggies that kill diabetes. Watch this free video presentation now. Thank you for watching. Talk to you soon.